Welcome to the Sun today for the 28th of March 2025. Until earlier today I was preparing a video to explain why we had so few flares and why the sunspot number had dropped so much, and opening the possibility that we had started our slide towards solar minimum. That still may be true, but to change all that we just had an X flare from a region on the east limb. And so we're going to focus on that today rather than the larger solar cycle implications. Well, solar activity has been quite low for the last few days, which is why I haven't had any reports. Sunspot number has actually recovered a little bit. It's now up at around about 80. We've just had two new sunspot regions appear on the disk of the sun. Flare activity was quite interesting. We have 4 C flares, 3 M flares, which is the most we've had for a long time, and an X flare, which is the first this month. That X flare produced an R3 radio storm, which is a strong radio storm. We also had 3 CMEs, which is surprisingly low. But then again, there's a lot of missing coronagraph data, so I'm not quite sure how many of those were missing. The solar wind speed is still quite high, around about 650 kilometers per second, but seems to be declining slightly. Let's take a look at the sunspots. We have 7 regions on the disk, 2 of which are new, that's 46 and 47. 47 doesn't show up very well here, but in the later images there is a significant spot group there, and it seems to be growing quite rapidly. It was 4046 that produced the X flare on the limb, in fact, and you can see some of the post-flare loops here on the northeast limb. Sunspot area was still quite low at 440 millionths, and I suspect that may start to increase somewhat as 4046 becomes more visible. The one thing I could have reported over the last few days was the geomagnetic storm. We had a G2 geomagnetic storm a couple of days ago, and then sort of a grumbling G1 level for the last 24 hours. However, today the geospace has seemed to have recovered somewhat, and the KP index is varying between about 2 and 4, so not very active. And you can see that the auroral arc is not particularly spectacular at the moment. So let's take a look at some of the details of the X flare. It's an X1.1 flare. It occurred at 1520 UT from the sunspot region 4046 on the east limb. I'm going to show you 2 movies. One is going to be from the AIA instrument helium-2 channel, which is about 50,000 degrees. So this is the so-called cool material from the sun, and shows the best examples of ejecta from the sun. But the really high energy channel, the AIA 131 angstrom, is about 10 million degrees, and that's the real flare material, and that actually shows a very similar sort of picture. So you have a mixture of both very hot and very cool material being blown away from the sun at the moment. Here is the X-ray right curve from the GOES X-ray monitor. The X-ray background is still relatively low between these flares, about C1.3 or so, but you can see the X flare just picking above the X level. And we also had 3 M flares since the X flare, so things are really picking up. Let's take a look at the coronal mass ejections. We had 3 recorded, which, as I say, is quite low for all this activity. The Soho-Lascaux movie will show you where they are, but there is unfortunately a lot of missing data. One thing to note is since we last looked at this, they've flipped the spacecraft, so the occulting disk support arm is now to the southeast rather than to the northwest. And they've now also corrected the background subtraction algorithm so we can see the stars more clearly in that bottom sector. So what's my forecast for tomorrow? The sunspot number is likely to rise as more sunspots come over the east limb. The flare rate should increase accordingly. The solar wind speed remains high, but I think it's declining somewhat, so we may see a drop there. And no CMEs will hit Earth. That CME on the east limb is too far east for it to affect the Earth directly. The only effect of the X-flare was a radiation storm, which is just the X-rays hitting the Earth. I think another geomagnetic storm is unlikely for at least a few days until that region comes over into the Western Hemisphere, and if it produces an event like the one we just saw, we could be in for some very spectacular auroral displays. Once again, thank you for listening. If you enjoy these videos, please pass them on to friends or neighbors or relations who you think might benefit from understanding more about how the sun works. And so until next time, stay safe and goodbye.